Donald Trump campaigned on restoring free speech. One of his first acts as president was passing an executive order, symbolically doing so. But in so many ways, his second term has eroded our First Amendment protections. I talked to Ari Cohn today, who's the lead counsel for tech policy at one of the most principled free speech organizations in America, the FIRE. Over the past few months, the Trump administration has revoked funds from major universities like Harvard and Columbia, mainly on the basis that those schools weren't sufficiently censoring critics of the foreign government of Israel on their campuses. And in order to get those billions of dollars in federal funds back, universities have to accept the federal government's various conditions, which include adopting new campus speech codes and, in some cases, government control over the university's curriculum. Columbia is the latest university to cave to those demands. They announced a deal last week that basically accepted all of the federal government's conditions, which included, quote, formalizing and adopting a definition of anti-Semitism that addresses what they call anti-Zionist discrimination, which is exactly what Columbia did. They adopted this restrictive IHRA speech code that bans even the sorts of criticisms of Israel that, Israelis themselves make about their own country. Another demand from the Trump administration, as I mentioned, was that the university make these new hires and reorganize its regional studies program. And Columbia agreed to that too. Essentially, government control over the curriculum. My main question with all of this is the federal government even allowed to condition aid to universities just based on whether or not those universities censor the speech that the government wants censored and teach the ideologies that the federal government wants taught?
I mean, generally speaking, no. The federal government is not allowed to condition the distribution of benefits on the forfeiting of constitutional rights, including the rights to decide what speech a private university wants to allow or disallow, or what it wants to teach. The complicating matter here is the leveraging of funding in terms of government investigations and things like that. And it really it all amounts to a gigantic shakedown, is what it is. And as law professor Oren Kerr pointed out the other day, the settlement agreement is good until the end of Donald Trump's presidency, and then it ceases to exist, which, if we normalize this, what that amounts to is basically, regardless of what party ends up in office, you are voting from here on out for the extortionist in chief, because this is going to be a tactic that will be seized on by whoever's in office to extract whatever they want from higher education. And it's lamentable that Columbia caved to the extent it did, and sacrificed its institutional academic autonomy. And they'll say they don't, but I think, once you have somebody installed to monitor academic programs and monitor hiring and admissions, you're really reaching when you say the government has no ability to influence or leverage or control those things. That's the entire point of installing this person. And of course, the adoption of an overly restrictive definition of anti-Semitism that would ban speech that is entirely constitutionally protected and ought remain so, is equally problematic. It's troubling for higher education, and now we see reports this week that Harvard is looking at negotiating with the administration, and we're hoping that Harvard can stand resolute where Columbia didn't. There may or may not be some legitimate bases for some government concern about some things, but certainly not as broad as this administration has purported them to be, given that it seemingly just wants to stifle speech that it doesn't like, and academic programs it doesn't like, and also the process that it's been using has just been completely inappropriate, devoid of any semblance of due process, and really evincing an outcome based rather than a we want to actually investigate and find out if something is wrong here attitude. And it's just a depressing sign of the times. And if Harvard collapses in the way that Columbia did, higher education is going to be in real trouble, because if Harvard and Columbia can't stand up for themselves, what hope to do universities without bazillions of dollars have, really?
Right, and Columbia settled for $200 million. The New York Times reports that Harvard's considering a settlement of close to $500 million. One of the things that I hear from defenders of this campus censorship regime, which is mainly conservatives at this point, is that this isn't about policing criticisms of Israel. It's not. It's about what they call hate speech. That chants like, globalize the Intifada, or most recently death to the IDF, that those are actually incitements to violence and therefore cross the line into the separate category that, someone told them exists, that's called hate speech. But hate speech is something I thought only existed in countries like, the UK and in the EU, the ones that Vice President J.D. Vance called, despotic censorship regimes when he was in Munich just a few months ago. In the United States, though, you are allowed to say all kinds of things that other countries would consider hate speech and really arrest you for. You can say death to the IDF, or worse, just like Israel supporters can say, starve away or turn Gaza into a parking lot. It's all protected by the First Amendment because those slogans don't represent true threats of violence. They're just abstract ones. Can you explain whether or not those various campus chants and slogans are protected by our First Amendment, and whether or not there exists a separate category of banned speech in our country called hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply ironic considering that the same people now saying, "Well, we're not silencing free speech, we're silencing hate speech," are the same people who reacted with hysterics when the left did that, when people would say chant racist, epithets on campus. Both are equally wrong. Both are, there is no such thing as hate speech in First Amendment jurisprudence. Is a nominal thing. If you want to call it that, you can call it that. But hateful speech is protected the same as any other speech. And things like death to the IDF are certainly don't cross the line into true threats or incitement. First of all, it's pretty ridiculous to think that a student on campus chanting death to the IDF is expressing a serious intent to fly overseas and like kill a soldier in another country. Like, nobody believes that. Anyone who says they believe that is lying to you. And it's certainly not incitement, given that it has to be intended to and likely to incite immediate, like right this second, not 10 minutes from now, not 45 hours from now, right now, without having time to think, lawless action. First of all, unless you have an IDF soldier right in front of you, that's impossible pretty much. And the theory behind this is only in circumstances where a speaker is with a crowd that is so whipped up into a frenzy that it doesn't have time to think better of its actions before, just getting whipped up and going off and doing something because of something the speaker said. If there is any time for the listener to consider, hey, maybe I shouldn't do this unlawful thing, then the responsibility is not on the person who said the ideas, but the person who had the time to say, maybe I shouldn't do this, and decided to do it anyway. It is only in extremely narrow circumstances that are not posed by any of the things that you listed that we would place the responsibility on the speaker instead of the person who decided to do the bad act. We don't punish ideas in this country.
Right, and that's why no prosecutor in the United States brought incitement or insurrection charges against Donald Trump for January 6th, because there's just very broad protections for what you're allowed to say. Uh, but this is extended obviously beyond campuses. It really kind of has tentacles in every single federal government agency at this point. And the official argument from the federal government and its defenders in response to critics of this new censorship regime is that this is about defending the United States from what they call, quote, un-American and anti-American ideas. So, for example, the State Department and the DHS, they have this new policy where they surveil and they write dossiers on all visa holders and visa applicants in the United States to scan for if they've ever spoken harshly about the foreign government of Israel, which they say is a form of anti-Americanism. But let me ask you, is there anything more American than criticizing the United States government and its policies? And it might be the main thing that distinguishes the United States from the rest of the world, our robust civil liberties, and at least our aspirational commitment to this kind of right to dissent from our own government. And the Supreme Court has long maintained that, a key, if not the most important role of the First Amendment is to protect political speech, especially radical dissent, the sort of speech that we see on campuses and the type that the Trump administration is acting very vigilantly against to censor. So it seems to me, at least, that rather than immigrants who criticize the foreign government of Israel, it's actually government censors who are the ones who really hate us for our freedoms. You could say, at least it's those government censors who are actively working to destroy those freedoms and erode them. I'm wondering if you see it that way and agree.
I mean, I do, but I would flip it the other way. I would say there is nothing more un-American than trying to root out quote unquote subversive or un-American or whatever speech. You are 100% correct that there is nothing more American than criticizing the United States government and questioning anything about our principles or ideals, whatever. If the First Amendment can't withstand people questioning whether the First Amendment is worth it, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. Like the entire point. And Fire has always said, we will 100% defend the constitutional rights of anyone to say that we should repeal the First Amendment. If our ideals and principles can't stand up to challenge, what are they worth? Really nothing. So the entire founding bedrock of this country is that we, first of all, do not let government decide for us what ideas we can and can't say, and B, that we welcome challenge as a way to refine our ideas to make our democracy better. That is the whole point.
I want to shift now to the Trump administration's policy toward critical media because it involves exactly what you're talking about, the government trying to shape the ideas that Americans are allowed to hold. The Trump administration filed a lawsuit against CBS and Paramount for their 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. And a couple weeks ago, CBS Paramount settled that lawsuit, agreeing to pay $15 million to Trump's presidential libraries. And previously, Trump's FCC had said that the 60 Minute scandal could affect their approval of a forthcoming merger between CBS Paramount and Skydance. CBS Paramount paid literal tribute to Trump. And almost immediately afterward, Trump's FCC suddenly approved that proposed merger that they had been slow walking. The Fire recently described the FCC's approval of the merger as, quote, an unconstitutional shakedown from start to finish. Can you explain a bit why?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the lawsuit against CBS was garbage. There was no news distortion. And there was no whatever. Like this was routine journalistic editing to get to the point quicker. Like this is just something that is done routinely. Donald Trump knows that this is a meritless lawsuit. Why is he doing it? Because he has a track record of making people fold to litigation. And it's just particularly distressing that a major media conglomerate with so much money and so much ability to have a spine ended up being so invertebrate in this case and just collapsing like a house, like a deck of cards. Like it's really troubling, but that is nothing compared to the just complete malfeasance of the federal government in working with Donald Trump here to pressure CBS by way of threatening to hold up the merger unless it got what it wanted, which includes, by the way, an ombudsman at this new Paramount Global or Skydance or whatever the hell they're going to call it, to take complaints from the Trump administration about bias in programming. Like that is a direct jawboning hotline to a major media network for the president to register his displeasure with the programming choices of a broadcaster. That is insane, and that should strike anyone in this country as absolutely bonkers. not to mention the side deal of, how many millions of dollars of free PSAs and advertisements for Trump causes and what have you, and all the other concessions that it drew out. I mean, this was just a major extortion racket, and Brendan Carr at the FCC is not just complicit. He collaborated with Donald Trump on this, and it was very clear. All of a sudden, right after the settlement, the merger was approved. Here we go. I mean, they couldn't be more obvious about it if they tried. And the point is that they don't care because they know that they will receive accolades from their base for it. And it's a settlement. So it's not like, the courts are going to really have anything to do about it. And, if CBS and Paramount and Skydance and whoever, if they don't want to stand up for themselves, it's very difficult for anyone to really stop this from happening. And if journalists won't stand up for themselves, if networks won't stand up for themselves, they can expect more of this. As Fire's general counsel said a while back, before the new year, Paramount's not buying itself peace. What it's buying itself is a 4-year supply of lube, because you don't ever pay the extortionist just once. That's not how this works.
Yeah.
So, Paramount's in trouble. The rest of the media is in trouble because if nobody stands up for themselves, it's just going to keep happening.
Yeah, and Brendan Carr had said in interviews before that the outcome of this settlement between 60 Minutes and Trump would determine his approval or disapproval of that merger, or as he said, could you know come into play. Let me ask you about him specifically, the chairman of this agency, the FCC, Brendan Carr, who we were just talking about. He really emerged before the election as a principled defender of free speech, which is what makes this just so ironic. I mean, in 2021, for example, he said that, quote, a newsroom's decision about what stories to cover and how to frame them should be beyond the reach of any government official. But now that he's in charge, as you said, Brendan Carr has become perhaps the leading government official trying to insert himself into newsrooms and decide for them how to cover and frame their stories. To give an example, in April, Brendan Carr threatened Comcast publicly on X. He wrote that their refusal to adopt the government's arguments in the case of Obrego Garcia on their news shows amounted to, quote, news distortion and could be a violation of federal law. And you actually presciently warned as early as November 2024 that Brendan Carr, quote, ironically presents the actual threat to First Amendment rights by threatening government sanctions against constitutionally protected speech. What do you make of Brendan Carr's just total abandonment of his free speech principles? And how have his recent moves as head of the FCC, you just talked a little bit about them, but how have they confirmed your early suspicions that, his leadership of the FCC is a major threat to the First Amendment?
Yeah, well, I think Brendan Carr's only real commitment is to the principle of whatever will get him power. He was auditioning for this job from the get-go. This is what he wanted, and now he's in it. He's going to do whatever he wants to keep Donald Trump happy, so that he can retain his power. And he also threatened a radio station for broadcasting about an ICE raid, or broadcasting the location of ICE agents, saying that, oh, maybe they're not acting in the public interest if they're going to say this thing that I don't like. I mean, Brendan Carr is cosplaying as the editor-in-chief of the nation's media. And he's admitted as much. He said just the other week that the media needs a course correction. Well, I have news for Brendan Carr. That's none of his damn business. He has no power, no authority, no right to decide on the content that is broadcast over the airwaves and whether he thinks that, whether he agrees with it or thinks that it comports with his idea of the public interest. Because what Brendan Carr thinks is in the public interest is ideas that Brendan Carr already agrees with. Plain and simple. That much is very clear. So, what he's doing is, just basically he's just being the chief censor of the media. And that's what Donald Trump wants him to do. That's what he wants to do. I don't think that necessarily is about face. I think anybody who does this was never principled in the first place. I don't think he was corrupted. I think he was lying.
I have one more question if you have the time. I'm not, maybe I'll
Yeah,
put
for
it
sure.
in, but it was just something that came to mind. I might cut it if you don't like it, if it's too personal, but I think it might be interesting. I if you're and I'm Jewish as well. I imagine you are just based on Ari Cohn.
Good assumption.
Yeah. Um, it's just kind of the case that in the Jewish community, there is a certain pressure. It's not always overt, but it's there to embrace Israel, I'd say, and to defend that foreign government. And what you do is actually not that. You're someone who defends the rights of free speech. You defend principles, not foreign governments. And in many cases, there's conflict between those. I mean, it's just been the case that there has been a massive censorship regime in the United States for many decades, uh, perpetrated by the Israeli government and NGOs associated with it, like passing, anti-BDS laws in numerous states, in most American states. So it's been a problem for a while. But if you believe in those principles of free speech, then it doesn't really matter who you're defending or, what the political outcome necessarily is of that. And that was the case too with like the very famous Jewish lawyers who defended the rights of Nazis to speak and to march in Skokie, Illinois, which really was a defining American moment. How do you navigate that personally? Uh, those pressures and just those conversations. I imagine defending students at Columbia who are labeled as, terrorist supporters, people who want to, kill Jews, we're told, uh, gets you a lot of hate from friends and family or just people who you know in the Jewish community. How do you navigate that?
So it's great that you mentioned Skokie because I was going to go there. I grew up in Skokie, Illinois, and I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community. But I grew up being taught to revere that tradition of sticking up for principle and, you know, saying, hey, what the ACLU did in that case was absolutely the right thing to do. And we don't need to be protected from bad ideas. We don't need to be infantilized. We can stick up for people's rights, even if they're saying things that we hate. That was a tradition, even in an Orthodox Jewish community in Skokie, with a high percentage of Orthodox Jews. That even in that situation, I was raised to in that vein. So for me, it's always kind of been second nature. And it doesn't help that I'm always been a bit of an anti-authoritarian and contrarian. So the typical two Jews, three opinions thing like is completely present within just myself. So I kind of personality wise fit in. But I will say, I have a broad spectrum of friends, even within the Orthodox Jewish community, with completely different views on this. And for the most part, I am fortunate, and maybe it's because you tend to be friends with people who can tolerate you. I don't get that much hate from people I know. It's more from random people on, say, on the internet who will say, how could you betray your people like this? Some of whom happen to not even be Jewish in the first place. I don't know what right they think they have to tell me. For me, I have never had 1 second of doubt that what I am doing is the right thing. I am not so easily swayed by the contempt of others to give up what I think is right. And I think the I think the Jewish community is more nuanced in its views than a lot of people might think or see. And perhaps that is because of some self-censorship where people are afraid that people in the community might ostracize them. And if so, I would encourage those people to speak up and give others the courage to speak up, because I think there's a broad array of different opinions on this, even within the Jewish community. And I prefer, intend, and will always continue in that line of tradition of Jewish lawyers who stood up for civil rights, civil liberties throughout history, and there's nothing that'll shake me from that. People can hate me as much as they want. That's fine.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it takes Exactly that kind of attitude that you have to do what you do, because obviously there is that pressure that does exist to, not defend certain types of people, or to associate guilt with the person who's representing their client. That happens all the time as well.